and then you can record whenever you get around to it. Hi, Marcia. I know we can't hear you, but I see that you're there. And hi, Shelley. Hi, Jack.
Hi. Hi.
All right. So there isn't going to be that much in this class you haven't heard before, but I'm hoping there may be it may fill in some gaps. I found some interesting material, and I hope it's interesting to you as well. So this week's Parsha has arguably the most famous line in Deuteronomy, even though I think last week or 2 weeks ago I said that one was arguably the most famous line. Not on bread alone does a man live. In this one we have Tzedek Tzedek Tirdof. So I'll just read the broader context. Our parsha starts off, you shall appoint magistrates and officials for your tribes and all the settlements that the Lord your God is giving you, and they shall govern the people with due justice. Right? We talked before about the specifics of choosing judges and leaders and all of that. So here it just says you should choose them, and then immediately goes to how they should act. How they should execute this justice. You shall not judge unfairly. You shall show no partiality. You shall not take bribes, for bribes blind the eyes of the discerning and upset the plea of the just. Justice shall you pursue. And, the commentators have, kind of go into interesting analysis of why it says it twice. Is it just for emphasis? Is that you should have justices that, work really hard to get justices that are going to be honest and not have their own agendas, and etc. Justice shall you pursue, that you may thrive and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you. So this, I've heard this before, and it comes from something that we're going to read later, but I wanted to kind of give it up front to kind of set the tone. Mordechai Kaplan, famous rabbi, I think he was originally conservative at JTS, and then he founded the Reconstructionist movement, famously suggested that Judaism is best described as a civilization because Jewish identity involves attachment to a specific land, language, literature, and music, art, and people, in addition to beliefs and morals. Right? And this is something that a lot of people have a hard time with. They see Judaism as a religion in the modern sense. And I've talked about this before, and I'm sure you've heard about this before. And if anybody has questions along the way, just jump in.
No, I love it.
Right? It's pretty, yeah.
Well, I love it because people will ask, we say we're Jewish. Well, other people are Italian or Irish. It's a religion that we refer to. I love the word civilization. I'm going to adopt it.
Good. Yeah, and it's something. It's something that unless people are willing to kind of take another mental step, another logical step, they're just not going to understand it.
Yeah. I love it.
Good. So Torah without civil law is not sustainable, right? One of the original people I met on Staten Island, when I was doing hospice work, lived right in the middle of a very ultra-Orthodox. It wasn't ultra-Orthodox when he moved there, but it kind of grew up around him, and he rails at some of the civil practices, and what he sees as rudeness and all of that. And in his mind, it's if they don't do civility as he understands it, then there's no point to their Torah. And he's onto something. That idea does exist. So Torah without civil law is not sustainable. Rashi suggests that the Jews were given the mishpatim, civil laws, before the general revelation of all the religious laws. And he bases it on this verse here, by Yitzhak el Adonai. So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. There he made for them a fixed rule, mishpat, and there he put them to the test. Mishpat is generally seen as the kind of mitzvahs that are civil type laws, kind of the common sense type laws. And as I mentioned, Rashi, at Mara, right, this was in the context of when they needed water. At Mara, he gave them a few sections of the Torah in order that they might engage in the study thereof. And the sections containing the command regarding the Shabbat, the red heifer, and the administration of justice. And Shemot Rabbah, I'm skipping the whole broader part, just not because it's about something else, but this one line. There was a matron walking along, and the matron part is in caps because I'm assuming it's the same word, but it's actually in Hebrew written as matrona. Walking along, guards preceded her and guards followed her. Similarly, civil law dinim precede Torah and follow her. And the Eitz Yosef on Shemot Rabbah. First, civil laws preserve the people that live by them. Where am I? Live. That people can then be dedicated to a life and study of Torah. Alternatively, keeping the civil laws helps us uphold all of the Torah, including her religious and ethical mitzvah. So I'm going to switch gears now to a paper I found written by Rabbi Elliot Dorff. I've mentioned him before. He's one of the top voices in the conservative movement. It's an old paper from 1978, but I think it's still applicable to us. The original paper I have here, but I was kind of going through it on my own and highlighting some, because depending on how it flows, we may just do a little bit of jumping instead of just reading. You know, sometimes reading a long text can be boring. So the introduction, well, the title, really, Judaism as a Religious Legal System, by Rabbi Elliot Dorff. Introduction. Americans are accustomed to thinking about Judaism as a religion comprised primarily of beliefs and moral maxims, right? And this is based on, at the time of the Enlightenment, Jews were hoping, at least the ones that were open to secular society, were hoping to finally be accepted. And they believed that if they ditched the nationalistic, the civilization, those aspects of Judaism, and instead focused in on solely the religious part of Judaism, then they could be seen as any other religion, any other Protestant religion, for example, and still be seen as loyal citizens in whatever country they're in, and hopefully not have to deal with anti-Semitism anymore. And they were operating under the belief that, and it's not entirely faulty, that a lot of anti-Semitism came from people seeing them as not being completely loyal, because Jews were always talking about wanting to go back to Israel and looking out for each other, right? So this was a conscious effort that was made to to bring Judaism as solely a religion, and it worked. How much of it they get credit for, how much of it would have happened anyway, I don't know. But that's how we're perceived, including by a lot of Jews who don't know differently. And when it comes to Israel, that obviously backfires. These Jews never imagined that we would be able to, reestablish a modern state of Israel. Or if they imagined it, they didn't think it was a good idea. All right. Just a little tangent there. Americans are accustomed to thinking about Judaism as a religion comprised primarily of beliefs and moral maxims. Judaism is a religion. It does espouse beliefs and norms of behavior, but it includes much more. As Mordecai Kaplan has suggested, Judaism is best described as a civilization. So all the bold in this article is my own. I just copied and pasted it in here, and then I was able to edit it. Because Jewish identity involves attachment to a specific land, language, literature, music, art, and people, in addition to beliefs and morals, religion is the core of the civilization because it gives all of the other elements their distinctly Jewish character, but it is not the totality of what it means to be Jewish. The fact that Judaism is a religious civilization is important for two reasons. First, along with the specific attachments identified by Kaplan, Judaism includes a body of law, right? And you can't be a civilization without having a legal system. In fact, this body of law is central to the meaning of Judaism. The centrality of law becomes clear when one notes that the rules which govern Jewish life all require that Jews do specific things and refrain from doing others, not that they believe one thing or another. Right? I mean, that's a fascinating aspect of the Torah. Even by the Shema, it doesn't explicitly say, you must believe this. It says a statement, God is one. Right? There's nowhere that it says, unlike as he'll say a little bit further, unlike in Christianity, where unless you embrace Jesus, garnished, you're not a Christian. In Judaism, there are no explicitly required beliefs. The rabbis later obviously included parts, right? So we'll get to that. But it's all about actions. There are beliefs that characterize mainstream Judaism, but Jews have expressed and interpreted them in a wide variety of ways, and no set of dogmas ever has become authoritative. I wouldn't completely agree with that. Like we have the Yigdal and we have some of those other things which have certainly become authoritative, but not universally agreed upon, is what I would say. Jewish law, on the other hand, is that a statement coming or is that a banging? All right. Jewish law, on the other hand, is detailed in its demands and its observance, and its observance traditionally has been considered essential to having an identity as a Jew. Thus, if a committed Jew were asked to identify the essence of the Jewish faith, his or her answer probably would begin with a discussion of the specific practices it requires, and then describe its association with a specific people, land, and history, and only then mention of beliefs that logically undergird those practices and associations would follow. Right? So it's not that we don't have beliefs, it's just that that's kind of the underpinnings of everything else, and eventually we get to that. And we don't all agree on what they are. This description is in sharp contrast to that which most likely would be given by a Christian, because the most important element of the Christian faith is the belief that belief requires appropriate behavior, but Christian beliefs are described with much more specificity than Christian behavioral requirements. Furthermore, a Christian cannot achieve salvation by works alone. For a Jew, however, observance of the law is central, and consequently, development of the law is something naturally to be expected. And for those that just joined us, this is from Rabbi Dorf of the conservative movement, a paper he wrote in 1979 that's applicable to this week's Parsha about having a legal system and having a just legal system. The second reason that let's see, what was why it's important to see Judaism as a civilization. The second reason that the nature of Judaism is a religious civilization is important is the opposite of the first. In this case, because Jewish law developed in a religious context, many features of its methodology consequently by religious concepts and concerns. In other words, it's a civilization, but it can't be completely divorced of religion either. It's not completely a religion, but it's not completely not a religion. In other words, although Judaism is not a just religion, it is not just a legal system either. It combines religion and law and gives both a higher priority than it ascribes to the other elements of the Jewish civilization, such as gefilte fish and Manischewitz. Moreover, Judaism seeks to integrate religious sensibilities into the legal structure as fully as possible. This integration makes the law the major vehicle for the expression of those sensibilities and makes religion the foundation for law and the medium through which it operates. Consequently, studying the relationship between religion and law in Judaism is crucial to an understanding of what is central. When you look at it as only one, inevitably you're going to run into dead ends because it's just not going to add up. Is central to Judaism and also to an analysis of how religion and law can interact when their symbiosis is taken seriously. This study of Jewish law is divided into 3 sections in this article. First, he's discussed the theoretical aspects of the relationship between religion and law and Judaism, and the last studies their interaction in practice. The first part explains why Judaism, just to be clear, there's no way we're going to end this today, so there's going to be at least 2 classes. But the first part explains why Judaism, I think even if you miss the next class, it's still valuable. So don't hang up. The first part explains why Judaism is a legal system like all other legal systems, despite its religious elements. The second part delineates the ways in which the Jewish legal system nevertheless remains a religious legal system. Finally, the third part describes the practical effects that the Jewish religion has on Jewish law. All right, so that was just the introduction. Judaism as a legal system. The Christian influence on American thought makes it difficult for Americans to conceive of Judaism as a legal system, right? Because religion is supposed to be about spirituality. It's supposed to be about your worship. It's supposed, So how would it be a legal system? Sure, there might be some laws about the way you worship, but it's much more than that. That factor, however, is not the only one that makes such conception difficult. Several features of Jewish law seem to disqualify it as a legal system in the commonly accepted understanding of that term. I don't know if we have any lawyers with us today. I don't think so, off the top of my head. But it would be interesting if we did. For example, the Bible claims that Jewish law was initiated by God at Sinai, amidst thunder and lightning, and it speaks of Moses and other prophets who added to that law by speaking to God, often in rather eerie circumstances. These events certainly do not resemble the normal legislative process by which human beings create and extend the law, right? So there's the first difference. The law coming from God versus it coming from, a group of people making a constitution. Moreover, under Jewish law, an omniscient God, as well as human judges, renders judgments, and enforcement of those judgments is not restricted to the remedies that human beings impose. Right? God, a supernatural God can, even if the court gets it wrong and acquits somebody, can still punish that person. An omnipotent God who controls nature and history uses his powers to provide an inescapable mechanism of enforcement for his laws. Thus, in all three aspects of law, legislative, judicial, and executive, Jewish law seems to be a peculiar legal system. Jewish law certainly is different from non-religious systems of law in a number of respects, but it is also remarkably similar to all other legal systems in a number of important ways. Jewish law is most similar to secular law in the subject matter that it covers. Judaism includes regulations that normally would be characterized as religious, true, such as ritual and family laws. Large segments of Jewish law, however, cover subjects that ordinarily are considered secular. Right. This also talks to the separation of church and state, which in traditional Judaism doesn't exist. These subjects include a whole range of civil, criminal, and even agricultural matters, as Shelley knows well from his Talmud studies, such as laws governing personal injuries, landlord-tenant relations, bailments, theft, planting crops, irrigation, court procedures, etc. Jewish law also resembles secular law in its enforcement procedures. Judaism assumes that God will act as the ultimate enforcer, but Jewish law does not hesitate to use remedies imposed by human authorities. Right now, for most of us, this is not our experience, but even in today's day and age, there's a little bit of this, and there certainly was a lot more of it in previous times. These remedies have varied in form with changes in time and location, and have included such measures as compensation, fines, excommunication, lashes, and perhaps even death. The parties who executed these punishments also have, well, not perhaps, we know, I'll stick with perhaps. Who executed these punishments also have varied. When Jews ruled themselves, the leaders of the community appointed judges and officers to enforce the law. During the periods of Persian, Roman, Arab, and Polish rule, governmental bodies compelled Jews to obey the rulings of Jewish courts. Right? And so even though they were kind of seen as a people within a people. For about the last 1,000 years, however, the Jewish community did not enjoy autonomy or the support of the secular government in executing its laws. Still, the community remained a cohesive body and was able to enforce the law on its own to different degrees. The most important way in which Jewish law resembles secular law is in its methodology. In light of biblical materials, this claim may seem untenable, but it is valid. The Bible says that the Torah is God's command and that human beings may not alter it in any way. In other words, the law cannot be changed or extended by legislation. Great. The Bible does, however, provide two ways to amend biblical law. One is prophecy. God can and does continue to speak to human beings, and his words must be heeded. So even if it contradicts something in the previous law, as long as it doesn't say to worship idols or something like that, you have to listen to the prophet. The other is judicial interpretation. In chapter 17 of Deuteronomy, which I believe is in this week's Parsha, God requires that each generation address its questions about the law to the judges of that generation, and whatever the judges decide is conclusive. Right? Now, that in itself is subject to interpretation of how much latitude the judges have. But there is, and that's the key, as you'll see, the key authority that the rabbis that have legislated operate under. Because, there is an explicit commandment that says you can't change this law at all, and yet we know that there are changes. Judaism is not identical to the religion of the Bible. I mean, just to say that line is fascinating, right? Judaism is not identical to the religion of the Bible. However, and Jewish legal methodology is not identical to biblical methodology, right? It's not saying it's not completely, it's not saying that it's not at all identical. It's just saying it's not completely identical. Judaism is based upon the way the rabbis of the Talmud and Midrash interpreted the Bible, right? So that's why we're known as rabbinical Judaism, and because we don't only follow our understanding of the literal, any person who's reading the Bible can't, according to rabbinic Judaism, can't just go and interpret it on their own based on the literal read, but they need to follow, based on Deuteronomy 17, to follow the rabbis and judges. Consequently, Jewish legal methodology is the rabbinic methodology, and the differences between the Bible methodology make the operation of Jewish law very similar to that of a secular legal system, right? Where you have humans making the laws and executing them. The first difference in methodology results from the rabbis' claim that revelation ceased shortly after the destruction of the first temple. So I'll just read that again because that's a really important one. The first difference in methodology results from the rabbis' claim that revelation ceased shortly after the destruction of the temple. And we'll see in a moment why that's important. They even denied authority to revelations claimed by members of their own sect, because prophecy had served in biblical times as a source of new laws and interpretations, and because the Torah prohibited legislative amendments to the law, the rabbis needed to find other ways of adapting the law to new circumstances. Accordingly, they greatly expanded the judicial powers created by the Torah in chapter 17 of Deuteronomy, and claimed that God only speaks to mankind through their interpretations of the law. The rabbis thus clearly and consciously shifted the operation of the law from the prophets to the judges, and from revelation to interpretation. Why did the rabbis substitute interpretation for prophecy? Part of the reason undoubtedly lies in the problems inherent in using prophecy. One of these problems is evident in the Bible's struggle to create a method of distinguishing between true prophets and false ones, right? And like we saw in our parsha last week, where there's mention, it says, if a prophet comes along, even if they're able to, if some guy comes along, and even if they're able to predict the future or, do some other supernatural thing, which under other circumstances, the person might say, wow, if this person can do supernatural things, they must be connected to the supernatural and ultimately to God. and therefore whatever they say is authoritative. If somebody like that says you should go and worship idols, they say, false prophet, off with his head. Right? So the fact that it says that this person can actually do supernatural things suggests that, that's a possibility. Rabbi Akiva and other commentators were very uncomfortable with this idea and tried to interpret it away in all kinds of ways, because how is it possible for a false prophet to be getting this information? Like, if God doesn't want this person to get it, why are they getting it? It talks about tests and different things like that. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here a little bit, but the point is that the rabbis were really concerned that people were going to say that they wake up one morning, say they had a prophecy, and change the law, and they didn't really know how to distinguish who they should trust and who they shouldn't. All right. If prophecy is accepted, the problem is mutability of the law. God conceivably could announce completely new rules through a prophet, or at least a prophet could claim that he had done so. Accepting prophecy, therefore, spells legal chaos. Right? Suggesting context, this was before Christianity, whereas in Christianity, the idea, at least for some, is that this is basically just that Jesus came along, he was a prophet, and God told that the old rules don't apply. Now we have a New Testament. Right? But according to Judaism, prophets anymore. The change from prophecy to interpretation was also motivated by the rabbi's conviction that the Torah needs interpretation. Right? There are things that are so vague that it just doesn't spell out. And so it's clearly, requires interpretation, regardless of prophecy, that even the accepted revelation in the Torah cannot stand alone because it is ambiguous. Moreover, interpretation is necessary because Jewish law needs to retain sufficient flexibility as times change. Indeed, the rabbis considered new interpretations and expansions of the law not only necessary, but also desirable. Right? Of course, the risk with this part, just like you can have false prophets, you can have tangents and religious, rabbis and groups who can interpret different than the main rabbis, which is what we have today. And sometimes it can get pretty, it can be quite, the difference can be quite wide, and and it gets tricky. Finally, human interpretation and application of the law is necessary because God required it in chapter 17 of Deuteronomy. Not to interpret the law anew in each generation would be to disobey God's law. Right? If given the authority, that means that you were supposed to use that authority. Why else would it be given to you? For all of these reasons, then, the rabbis abandoned revelation and relied exclusively on interpretation. Because each generation adds its own interpretations, however, the question arises as to how there can be any coherence or consistency in the law using the interpretive methodology. So this is going to be a little bit harder to follow. I'll go slow, and feel free to jump in. So the obvious question is, how do you maintain coherence when you have all kinds of rabbis doing interpretation? The question is difficult, but the rabbis faced it squarely, answering it in three ways. First, The tradition would remain coherent despite the many variations of opinion because the interpretations all derived from God. Right now, exactly what that means, we'll get to. Notwithstanding the variations in interpretations of the rabbi, they are still interpretations of one document, the Torah, and as such, they will be cohesive because God, the author of that document, may be presumed to be consistent. Not the most satisfying answer, but that's one of them. Second, the tradition will be cohesive because there is a sense of continuity within the tradition. There's a famous story in the Talmud that illustrates this point when Moses visited the academy of Rabbi Akiva, who lived some 1400 years after him. He did not even understand what Rabbi Akiva was saying, let alone agree with it. Nevertheless, Moses was comforted when Rabbi Akiva cited one of the new laws in Moses' name, because that indicated that there was a sense of continuity in tradition, however much it had changed in form. It's a fascinating story. Right? It also reminds me of the story of that famous oven where God says the law is like this guy, but the rabbis had a majority in the other direction, and they say, the Torah is not in heaven. This sense of continuity can be maintained only if those who have studied the tradition carry on its spirit and substance in new settings. The tradition, however, must be studied well, right? If somebody gets a rabbinical degree on the internet and decides that they can change all of the traditions, probably not a good idea to follow them. The rabbis knew only, and especially now when people want to officiate a wedding, they become a minister for $50, and that's it. Anyway, the rabbis knew only too well the consequences of trusting the law's coherence to those who did not know it thoroughly. When the disciples of Shammai and Hillel multiplied, who had not studied with their teachers sufficiently, dissensions increased in Israel, and the Torah became like two Torahs. Nevertheless, the rabbis were convinced that the continuity and consistency that they sensed were real, and that the law in its present form, however different from the Torah, was a direct extension of it. Moses received the Torah from Sinai and handed it down to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets handed it down to men of the Great Assembly, right? And so that's how Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of Our Fathers, that the cantor is teaching on Monday evenings at 7 p.m., begins. And the reason that it's spelled out is to indicate the continuity of it. The third reason Jewish law would retain its coherence is that it includes a way of making decisions. For example, the Bible provides for the appointment of judges with varying powers. Rabbinic literature depicts a well-developed system of courts composed of 3 judges who handle civil matters and 23 judges who decided capital cases. There's also the Sanhedrin, the 71 judges for certain deaths. Thus, Jews had courts wherever they lived, including a system of appeal to a Supreme Court called the Sanhedrin. Even when the Sanhedrin ceased to exist and there no longer was a central authority in Judaism, Jewish courts continued to function so that the continuity of Jewish law was preserved. Thus, in certain periods, Jewish communities were sufficiently organized to have had centralized court systems, right? I mean, and even in today's day and age, when you look at kosher food, some of the hechshers, some of the certifications are, from the VOD of this or the, some of those bodies are courts. They're religious courts, and they settle certain matters. And there's another aspect which I didn't see, and I don't know if he gets into at the end. But because of the persecution and anti-Semitism over the years, Jews generally tried to avoid using secular courts because they didn't trust them. And so the strong custom was to bring it to a religious court. The general practice being that one litigant chooses one judge, the other one chooses one, and then they agree on a third one. That's the general idea. All right. Where am I? All right. So continuity of Jewish law was preserved. Thus, in certain periods, Jewish communities were sufficiently organized to have had a centralized court system. These court systems existed during the time of Hadron and during the Middle Ages, when there was synods of rabbis and community leaders who made far-reaching Jewry. An example of that was banning today for sections of world Jewry that have authorized specific bodies of rabbis to make decisions in Jewish law on their behalf. For example, the Rabbanut in Israel. When no such, or of course the Committee on Law and Standards in the conservative movement, when no such centralized authority existed, each community followed the decisions of its local rabbi and the court he often chaired. All right, I'll go till the end of the page and then stop there for questions. Because Jews have lived in many different situations all over the world, that the court in each community makes decisions appropriate to its particular settings is probably a good thing, right? There's different needs in different places at different times. Jewish law thereby gains the necessary flexibility to enable it to work in many different times and places. Nevertheless, the existence of a clear way of making decisions wherever Jews live, there's a framework, together with a sense of continuity and the dependence upon one Torah, gives Jewish law coherence and a reasonable degree of consistency. The rabbis explicitly claim that human judges in each generation have the authority to make decisions in Jewish law, and that God no longer has the right or authority to do so. Right? Without even looking at the footnote, I'm pretty sure he's talking about that that story that I mentioned. But I'll look at the footnote just to be sure. He doesn't spell it out here. Okay. Therefore, with all of the various interpretations of the law and the new applications of it, how is it in any sense divine? The rabbis clearly wanted to retain divine authority for Jewish law. Rabbis in each generation, however, had to assert their right to interpret or apply the law, right? And it's a sort of, can you have your cake and eat it kind of situation. But there was no simple way of affirming both the divine authority of the law and the right of human beings to interpret it. So the way it was taught to me growing up is what he's going to say now, which was the sort of trying to bridge that gap. In order to solve this dilemma, the rabbis, as well as was typical of them, asserted two propositions. On the one hand, they claimed that all latter developments in the law were originally revealed at Sinai. Right? And so anything any rabbi comes up with until the end of time, Moses was up there 40 days. It was a long time. It was revealed to him. Because all of the interpretations, extensions, and revisions of the law by the rabbis of all generations to come already were revealed at Sinai, they are imbued with divine authority. And even if they're, two rabbis and they disagree. On the other hand, the rabbis were aware that many of their interpretations and laws were new. And they held that it is God's desire that the rabbis create new laws in each generation. Moreover, they claimed that God revealed his will through these new interpretations. And so it's not direct prophecy, but it's kind of like prophecy as he goes on to explain, and we'll continue next week, prophecy by way of putting the system in place that it kind of guides us to come to where it was intended to get us to. And so it's not that Moses directly heard, the specific thing, but he put the principles and the framework in place. And so it's kind of like divine inspiration, or these different terms that are used when people want to say it still has some kind of divine authority, but it's not, a direct prophecy. So we'll close there. Any questions or comments?
Yeah, Shelley, I have a couple of comments.
Shelley.
One, you made a distinction between Jewish law, which is divinely inspired, and let's say American law. But I would say that there's a strong element of revelation in American law, like in the Declaration, we hold these truths to be something that all men are created equal and so on, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, I think is central to American law and probably may well be the basis of it. That's one thing. And secondly, the definition of civilization, the definition of civilization that you gave is, Jewish civilization is odd. Generally speaking, sort of if I remember right, the dictionary definition of civilization centers around land, cities. Like if you think of Mesopotamian civilization, Roman civilization, Greek civilization, American civilization, because civilization is, cities, roads, is an essential aspect of it. You may think of Israeli civilization, but it's hard to think of Jewish civilization in that context.
Right. And I think, because other than, the last 50 to 100 years, as settlement was happening, there were very few Jews relatively in Israel. It is hard, but that's certainly the basis. The basis is the land of Israel for that statement, and the fact that the prayers and and every year at the Seder, L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, all of that. So there was a connection maintained, even though in terms of civil laws and building roads and all that aspect of it wasn't there. Although to a certain degree they would have it, for example, there would be, the shuls would have soup kitchens, and there would be other kind of civil aspects to it, in many cases, especially in the ghetto. But even when there wasn't necessarily a ghetto, there was still often a lot of aspects of more than just community.
Well, it just needs a different word. It just seems like a stretching of the general, the usual definition of civilization. That's it.
Okay.
It is a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
Civilization. The making or becoming. Hold on. I have to raise it up. Civilization is the making or becoming civilized. The state of being civilized, the sum of the qualities of a particular civilized society. That's more encompassing what we're understanding here.
Well, that seems central, circular to me. It's civilization is a civilized society. It seems circular to me.
To endow with law, order, and the conditions favorable in the arts and activities to refine the manners and tastes. That's civilized somebody.
So I would, we can go down. This is a debate that's been raging long before any of us and long after. But what I would say is, from the words that are available to us, there's a reasonable argument to be made that that's the closest, that defines the whole of what Judaism is. Is it completely accurate? I don't know. How's that for
maybe that modification, religious civilization?
Oh, okay, but I guess they were afraid that would exclude. There's so many Jews who are atheists who don't practice the religion at all, but have a very strong Jewish identity.
Yeah, it's a struggle.
It is a struggle, and it's a struggle that's been going on for a long time. Anybody else?
If I could just, thank you, Rabbi, and I'm sorry I joined a little late, just to ask anybody on the call who has not submitted their survey about whether you are planning to attend in-person
And you can turn the
services.
recording off.
Oh.
Or maybe I can, I don't know.
And again, I emphasize this is not written in stone. You can feel you want to